Zoom recording. All right. So last time we were in almost at the end of the Amidah and the Talmud's explanation of how the Amidah was organized, why it was organized the way it was. And here we're up to the blessing for the Messiah, basically. The verse in Hosea says, afterward, the children of Israel shall return, achar yashuvu b'nei Yisrael, uvikshu et Hashem Eloheihem ve'et David malkam. And they will seek the Lord and David their king. So you have return, and then followed by the return of the Messianic king. So therefore, that blessing of the kingdom of David follows the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And once the scion, the descendant of David comes, at that time, prayer will come. And according to the note here, according to Meiri, this means that the coming of the Messiah is the realization of our most essential prayers, which is kind of interesting. So that when the Davidic throne is, or dynasty is returned, that's the culmination. And what's interesting is that this is Leon Liebrecht, who was a scholar of liturgy. This was his theory of the Amidah, that it's not the way that we conventionally taught, where it's broken up to three parts. First three is praise of God, middle 13 is asking God for things, last three is thank you, but rather it's a linear progression in which the goal is to bring about the Messianic era. And the conclusion, therefore, is the Messiah comes, descendant of David, and our prayers are answered. And here it says, but the Talmud has a slightly different approach. They're using verses in the scripture. You can see they're not, the verses come from all over the place. That I will bring them to my sacred mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. So the blessing of hearing the prayer is recited after the blessing of the kingdom of David. After prayer comes, then the temple service will arrive. And that's why we have, and here's a verse to prove that, same passages from the Isaiah 56, their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted on my altar. And following that comes thanksgiving. Whoever sacrifices a thanksgiving offering honors me. So again, this is it. But you can see that because they're just picking verses from scripture, it's not one place in scripture that they're finding it. It's pretty obvious that it's not that the verses from scripture are driving the order of the blessings the way they're making it seem here, but rather they've got the 19 benedictions and they're finding verses in the scripture to justify the order that already exists. They're suggesting that the verses are driving it, but it's actually clearly the other way around. Because here now, after Isaiah 56, now you've got a verse from Psalms to prove that the Thanksgiving blessing comes after the blessing, asking God to accept the sacrifices, or hoping that God is pleased with the sacrifices. And now, because of these verses, we've got a question. Why then would you say the priestly benediction, which follows the Thanksgiving blessing in the repetition of the Amidah, and then is followed by the very last blessing, the Shalom blessing, why should that come after Thanksgiving? Maybe it should come right after the blessing Ritzeh, which is all about God accept the sacrifices, and the priests recite that blessing for the people after the sacrifice. So so Ema Kodem Avodah. Should we then not say the priestly blessing before, or even before the blessing of the temple service? And the Gemara answers, it shouldn't enter your mind to say this as it is written, Vayered me'asod hachatat. See, is it written that he came down to sacrifice the offerings, implying that after blessing the people, Aaron sacrificed the offerings? No, it's the other way around. He came down from the sacrificing. So first of all, so now we know sacrifices followed by priestly blessing. Okay, so that's it. But what about?
I had a question here.
Yeah.
And it's not specifically this, but they use this formula, it should not enter your mind a number of times. Is that a rebuke as well?
No, I think what it is it's a way of saying lo salka datcha tatach is you might have thought an alternative explanation is this, but don't think that alternative explanation. So it's a way of saying there's two ways, you might have gone in this direction.
That's the wrong way to go.
Yeah, but that's the wrong way to go. So
not a rebuke for asking the question.
No. And they're just, it should not enter your mind as just a literal translation of lo salka datach. So it's really saying that, see, because you could have thought, right, we just had here the line, they're saying this verse from Leviticus makes the question of why not recite the blessing, the Ritzei blessing, and the blessings of the priests over Israel together. Because it says here, Aaron lifted up his hand toward the people and blessed them, and he came down from sacrificing the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offering. In the Hebrew, so you might have said, wait a minute, blessing comes first, followed by doing the sacrifices. And they're saying, no, don't read it that way. You might have thought that makes sense, but don't do that, because Vayered me means that it was, he came down after. He did the blessing after he did the sacrifices. That's how you should understand it. So it says me asot, not la asot. It would if you would assume that the blessing came first, then the sacrifices, the text should have read la asot, not me asot. And so therefore, don't make that mistake. But it's not criticizing a person for suggesting, it's just saying don't go in that direction. Then here is another question. Valemra achar havodah. So okay, all right. But then if what you've just told me is true, that we're reading it me asot, he did the blessing after he did the sacrifices. Well, then we should say the priestly blessing after the Ritzei blessing. But again, lo salka datcha, don't think that, because we've already had a verse which told us zoveach todah, whoever sacrifices a thanksgiving offering honors me, which means we learned that the thanksgiving offering follows sacrifice, which means thanks follows the sacrifices. So the moda, the hoda'ah, the Thanksgiving blessing in the Amidah has to follow the avodah blessing, the Ritzei blessing, because that's the order of these offerings. It would be these typical offerings. It would be the tamid, the daily offering, and then followed by that would be a todah sacrifice, a Thanksgiving offering. So that's why. Okay, so then the Gemara asks again, so why did you rely on that verse, the one from, which I forgot where it was from? Was it from Psalms? Yeah, from Psalm 50. Why does the verse from Psalm 50 take precedence over the blessing, or the verse here in Leviticus or or Isaiah, which is a legitimate question? I mean, again, they're just throwing out verses. So why is one verse better than the other? And the answer is that it seems like we have two verses. So why did you rely on this verse and juxtapose Thanksgiving with sacrifice, meaning Thanksgiving following the Ritzeh blessing? You could rely rather on the other verse, which indicates that it's the priestly blessing, benediction, that should be following the Ritzeh blessing. So the answer is mistabra. It stands to reason, or it's logical to have the blessing of Thanksgiving immediately follow the blessing of sacrificial service, since the sacrificial service and Thanksgiving, which are closely related conceptually, are one matter. That basically they're saying, since the blessing, the verse up here refers to another type of offering, this one called a Thanksgiving offering, and the verse from 56, Isaiah 56, refers to burnt offerings, that they're really kind of connected. So that the Hoda'ah blessing, Thanksgiving, and Ritzeh really are talking about the same thing. They're talking about offerings, just different types of offerings. So conceptually, they go together, the two blessings. So they should be connected, which again challenges the way that we usually think of the breaking up the Amidah, because the idea here is that Thanksgiving, we're not talking really about a Thanksgiving offering. We're talking about saying thank you to God for listening to us, to our petitions. And so the last three blessings we usually explain as, well, those are Thanksgiving blessings. But this kind of throws a wrench in there, because first of all, the Talmud is suggesting, no, the Thanksgiving blessing is really talking about the Thanksgiving offering. So you've got offerings at the end. We're actually focusing on the temple service, which would be kind of an ultimate hope of the return of the temple and the sacrificial worship. And of course, the Shalom blessing really has nothing to do with with thanking God. It's another request. So it's just interesting to see this discussion in the Talmud, besides some of the other explanations. When I was giving the class on the architecture of prayer, it was Dr. My brain is what's his name? Kimmelman. Boy. Reuven Kimmelman also sees it a little differently than Leon Liebrecht, but also as a linear progression of moving from one to the next, which is a little bit closer than what the Talmud's suggesting. Of course, he has a different approach. His is all based on redemption. But again, the idea that we usually explain, oh, well, it's three blessings at the beginning to praise God, then we ask for things, then we take our leave and say thank you, is really challenged by this passage in the Talmud. Anyway, all right. So again, why did they see fit to institute that one says the blessing beginning the words Sim Shalom after Birkat Kohanim? Because it says in that passage of Birkat Kohanim, they shall put my name upon the children of Israel and I will bless them. The priestly benediction is followed by God's blessing, and the blessing of the Holy One, blessed be He, is peace. The Lord blesses His people with peace. And which is, of course, the last line of the Birkat Hamazon. And we usually, most of our major blessings conclude with peace, with the concept, with the idea, the theme of peace. Also, the last word in the priestly blessings is peace, right? It's Isa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. So the word shalom goes right into the blessing for peace, God blessing us with peace. Okay, so now we have to explain, wait a minute, we learned earlier in a Baraita that there were two explanations for where this order, the Seder of the Amidah came from. One was that the men of the Great Assembly established it, including a number of prophets who were part of that group. But we also heard that it was Shimon HaPakuli who arranged it before Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, which was about the time of the destruction of the temple, the first century of the Common Era. So, which, how does that work? I mean, which one is correct? So the Gemara explains, and we've seen this approach by the Gemara. It was in Ta'anit, where certain prayers we were told were arranged by an earlier community of scholars, but we also learned that a later group arranged or created the prayers. And the answer is the same, that they created, it was developed at this earlier time, the men of the Great Assembly, that's like the 3rd century before the Common Era, but then people forgot about it, and Shimon Pakuli came back and he arranged them again, which I guess in theory makes sense. You don't have prayer books, right? So how would people really have to memorize these prayers, which obviously some did, but this was also a period of a lot of transition. The 1st century, the destruction of the temple, Jews are starting to move to Babylonia, to the diaspora. So I guess it's reasonable to assume that people would have forgotten the exact order, and then it took the period of the later rabbis, the rabbis of the post-destruction, to kind of reset, as it were.
Now, didn't we have that explanation earlier? I mean, like 1 or 2 classes ago?
Was that, well, 1 or 2 classes ago, we explained that it was those two, that we had competing explanations for why as to who organized the order of the Amidah. But I thought it was it in Megillah? I thought it was in Ta'anit when we learned
I thought we just had Shimon.
Oh, yeah. Shimon HaPakuli, right. We did just learn, right. That was when we learned that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked Shimon HaPakuli to arrange
Okay.
them. But, and we also learned from...
So now we're learning that he did arrange them. Before we were learning that he was asked to, is that?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
He arranged them, but we had competing explanations, and then the conclusion, the compromise in a sense is, okay, it was fixed by the elders of the Great Assembly, then people forgot, and Shimon HaPakuli came back and said, okay, this is what it used to be, I'm going to arrange it once again, so people should know it.
I was told, actually, my source on this is Jay, so it's indirect. Okay. But that in the century or two before the destruction of the temple, where we have both priests and rabbis at that time,
right,
and that the priests were an increasingly less competent and
more corrupt,
and really didn't, have organizational skills or the mission or whatever to hold their act together, and had to rely on the rabbis to tell them what they should be doing.
Right. So that is, and there's a famous passage in Yoma where they're talking about the high holiday of the Yom Kippur rituals, where the rabbis have to explain to the priests what they're supposed to do.
And that all fit together with this kind of picture you were drawing about, or that comes from here, I guess, that people simply didn't know, couldn't remember, didn't know how to proceed.
So the problem, what Jay's explanation is definitely found in rabbinic sources. The problem with, you always have to have, it's a little skeptical with the historicity of the rabbinic sources, right? So of course they're going to make it out like the priests didn't know what the hell they were doing and they had to go ask the rabbis for advice. But I'm not sure that My guess is that what's more interesting here to me is, where did this idea that you needed an Amidah prayer in any case? Because before 70 CE, the main worship experience was in the temple.
Yeah.
So are the rabbis, in a sense, offering an older memory that already 200 years, let's say, before the destruction of the temple, there were groups, and of course it makes sense, the diaspora is growing. You have groups that are developing a prayer service, a very organized prayer service.
Independently of the sacrificial service.
Yeah, right, because they're not able, if you're living in Asia Minor, or if you're living even, far away in, northern or southern Israel, how are you going to get to Jerusalem? So but you want to pray, you want to have some connection as a community to the divine. What do you do? So you start developing these experiences. And I think, so to me, that's what's so interesting, is that they've got this memory that way before the destruction of the temple, this prayer, this central prayer that we say 3 times a day, was being concretized. But you also have a tradition that it's a response to the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
And so it's like this continuation. So there was the temple service, and then that ended, and then we had this new approach as a response to the destruction. But it's very possible that they had this going on well before the destruction.
I thought that some of that the rabbinic tradition started developing late time of the Second Temple.
Exactly.
And I've sort of wondered I haven't gone out and tried to learn anything about it, but I've sort of wondered over the movement to centralize worship in Jerusalem, or I guess also in Shiloh, would seem to open up this possibility that people who aren't there want something.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that look, if we feel, I mean, we talk about it today, that there's a need for the human person to express, or at least a spiritual, an individual who's so spiritually focused, to express prayer of some kind. So why wouldn't it have been so 2,000 years ago? And if you couldn't go to the one, because remember, Jews were unlike all other ancient peoples who had temples and ritual offerings. You couldn't do that anywhere else. All the other groups, wherever you ended up, Rome or anywhere else in the of your community's diaspora, you just put up a temple and you do the same stuff there that you would do in your home community. Jews never did that. Jews were always, the only place you did these ritual offerings was in Jerusalem. So if you're living in Babylonia, if you're living in Asia Minor, if you're living in Rome, and you want to express this spiritual need, what are you going to do? You can send money. They certainly sent money, but that's not enough. So clearly something must have been developing. And I think that's how I read it. That's how I read that the authors of the source of this passage in the Talmud is basically saying, we've got this ancient memory that something was going on before the destruction, but you also have this approach that says, no, everything is linear historically. So until the temple's destroyed, the focus was the temple. After the temple's destroyed, we pick up we find a new way to do it. There wasn't this competition. But
you couldn't, I mean, it doesn't seem plausible to me that after the temple's destroyed, you just snap their fingers and bring them this else, other stuff.
Exactly. Something had to be going on. And I think that's what, in the last several hundred years, as we learn about the scholars of liturgy have pointed out that something was going on. And we also know archaeologically there were temples from this from before, I believe they found temples that existed before the destruction of the, not temples, Beit Knesset, prayer houses. What are they called? What's the term in Greek? I never know how to pronounce it.
Synagogue means.
Yeah. Well, but there was another term for a prayer house.
Is a good old New England expression.
Yeah, prosoich, I think was the Greek term, whatever. But yes, and obviously a synagogue. These were gathering places that they found, and I'm pretty sure they found them that existed. The archaeologists have found some that existed before the destruction of the temple. I know certainly after the destruction. What's that famous one? The Dura. Oh gosh, what's it called? It's that in Syria. I think that's pre-destruction of the temple. So you have these places. Anyway, so let's go on. We'll finish this passage. And here, so the question is, the problem with 19 benedictions or 18, this structure is, well, is that enough? And Rabbi Bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, you can't do too much. If you do more, there's no end to praising God. So it's a fool's errand to try to actually praise God enough. So we limit it to these benedictions we have here. In fact, they even find a verse again from Job in this case. If you tried to praise God anymore, you'd just be swallowed up. That in fact, it's a negative thing to try to do too much. The Gemara relates to Rabbi Yehuda of Kfar Giboraya. Some say he was Kfar Gibor Chayil. What's the meaning of which is written, for you silences praise, and that the best remedy, Sama de Kula Mashtuka. That's a great line to remember. The best remedy of all is silence. So therefore, and here's another verse, another aphorism, the same idea. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said in the West, that is Eretz Yisrael, there's an adage, if a word is worth one selah, silence is worth two. So, the same idea, silence is golden. And sometimes that's the best way to just pray. People who are really into the meditation, that's the highest form of praise, is just to meditate silently. Okay, so now we're into this, back to the Mishnah, and it said if one read the Megillah by heart, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Kra'a al peh lo yatsa. Where do we derive this? Rava said it's derived from a verbal analogy. This what we call gezerah shava. Zichira, zichira. So in one verse in the book of Esther, it's written the days should be remembered. And in the chapter 17 regarding the defeat of Amalek, it says, write it in this memorial book. There I will blot out the remembrance of Amalek. So you have this notion of remembering, and it's connected in the second verse to writing something down. So therefore, you then take that idea of writing something down and you put it back into the context of the first verse. So when it says remember, it means remember in the sense also of having it being written down and remembering. We'll see that again. It comes up that notion of that. It's called the Gezerah Shava, where you compare two different verses and you learn from one verse and from the context of one verse and you stick it into the first verse. But how do you know that zichira means reading it out loud? It said over here, the connection was zichira, remembering, and writing something down. So maybe, perhaps it merely is looking into the book, right? You have to have it written, but that doesn't mean you got to read it out loud. So again, we have this term, Lo salka datach, don't let it enter your mind. Don't let that possibility enter, because we have a Baraita which states, remember what Amalek did to you. You might have thought that it suffices to remember silently in the heart. Just remember, in your head what Amalek did. But because it says afterwards, lo tishkach, don't forget, all right, I mean, it means the same thing. Why did it have to say remember and don't forget? Because it is referring to forgetting from your memory. How then do I hold the meaning of remember? With the mouth, bapeh, meaning you got to recite it out loud. So we remember it by writing it down, and we remember it by reciting it out loud. Next passage, Kra'at Targum lo yatsa.
I've always been struck by this. This is slightly a side comment. That we're supposed to remember to forget Amalek.
Yeah. Well, no, right? It says remember, don't forget, right?
Well, no, but it says I will blot out.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Very good. Right. We're supposed to blot out the memory. Same thing with Haman, right? We're supposed to stamp out so we don't remember him. But if you,
but we're supposed to recount this every year.
Right. It's one of those paradoxes, great paradox. Okay. So Kra'at Targum lo yatsa. Now, this is really interesting. This next passage about language. And again, I don't know enough about the history of what Jews were speaking and the meaning of different languages, but we'll see as we go through this. Aramaic was clearly the vernacular of the Jews in certain parts at this time. Definitely in the land of Israel, Iraq, Babylonia, there are different types of Aramaic, there's different versions. The Aramaic of the Jerusalem Talmud is different from the Aramaic of the Babylonian Talmud. But Aramaic is the language that they were speaking. So it says here, if one read the Megillah in the Aramaic translation, then you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So what are we talking about? If we say that the Megillah was written in the original biblical text, that's Hebrew, that's the Ashurit font of Hebrew, and he read it in Aramaic translation, it's like reading it by heart, because you're not reading the text in front of you. You're reading it, but you're then translating, you're reciting it in a different language, this language of Aramaic, which isn't acceptable. You can't, we just learned you're supposed to read it out loud, but if you're translating it in your head into Aramaic and reciting it, it's not the same thing as doing it in Hebrew. So that's what they're saying here. If we say that the Megillah was written in biblical text in Hebrew, and then you read it in Aramaic translation, well, that's the same thing as reading it by heart.
So presumably, what's bad about reading it by heart is you don't stop and think about what you're reading.
Well, or I'm not sure, or if it's the language issue that is the Hebrew so important, which we're going to see that because Hebrew, you can read it even if you don't understand what you're listening.
Right. So it's not that struck me that this is really a sort of a ritual thing about the language.
Right. And now the confusing part is when we get to Greek. We're about to get to that.
Yeah.
So he says, no, it's necessary. So the question was, well, why do you have to teach it? If you just told us you can't read it by heart, you've got to read it out loud. And now you're telling us that if you were to read the Aramaic translation or to translate it while you're reading the Hebrew, you're translating it for the community in Aramaic, it's like reading it by heart. Why did you have to teach us that? We already knew that. Well, no, that's necessary, according to the Gemara. You had to teach this lesson as well, because it's a case where the Megillah was written not in the original Hebrew, but it's written in translation, and then he read it in translation. So in a sense, it's like saying, if you read if you had a scroll written in English today, and you read it in English, according to this passage right here, that's no good, because we want you to know, or maybe we should just focus, maybe it's too literally, we should read this as Aramaic, because I think it gets a little confusing as we get farther down. If you had a text written in Aramaic translation, which we do, there are official Aramaic translations of the Torah, because this is what the people were speaking. And some of these Aramaic translations also have interpretation embedded in them. If you had a text like that in front of you and you read it out loud, that's not good, because yes, you would be reciting, you wouldn't actually be translating it in your head, you'd be reading it from the text. And now you're reading the text as it is, but they're saying, no, that's not good enough. It's got to be written in Hebrew, and you can't, and it's not good enough to then translate it while you're reading it in Hebrew into the Aramaic. You've got to actually be reading the Hebrew out loud. Okay, so gets where the confusion is. The Mishnah continues, however, for those who speak a foreign language, one may read the Megillah in that foreign language. So is Aramaic not considered a foreign language? It's a little confusing to me here. Okay, so wait a minute. It says the Gemara raises a difficulty though. Didn't you just say if he read it in any other language, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation? The Gemara then cites Rav and Shmuel. Now, Rav and Shmuel are Babylonians. They're living in Babylonia. Their language, the vernacular is Aramaic. The obviously sacred language is Hebrew. They say when the Mishnah says a foreign language, it's referring specifically to the Greek foreign language, which has a unique status with regard to biblical translation. It was, I think, the first translation of the text. It's a Septuagint. Right?
Now, I thought for the Megillah, the Septuagint had a much longer text.
Right. So I don't know.
With a lot of extra things, including Esther's prayer to God.
So, right, exactly.
So this is sort of interesting that, and I believe that's the only book of the Hebrew Bible where there's that kind of enormous difference between.
So I don't know. I mean, it doesn't refer to the Septuagint here. It just refers to a Greek translation.
Maybe it's unnecessary to refer to the Septuagint by name.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
That's the only thing that fits this description.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So anyway, so then they say, well, okay, what's the situation? Hey, Chidami, what's the case here? If you say Ilema dichtiva Ashurit, that's Hebrew again. If you say that the Megillah was written in Hebrew, Bikarela Yevanit, right? So you're reading, the reader is reading the Hebrew text, but he's translating in his head into Greek for someone. You're back to the situation of reading it by heart. So that shouldn't be acceptable. So Amar Rabbi Acha, Amar Rabbi Elazar, the Mishnah is dealing with a case in which the Megillah was written in Greek and then was read in the same language. So it seems that is somehow acceptable if you read it if you have a Greek text, maybe it's the Septuagint, and you translate it, or no, I'm sorry, you don't translate, you just read it out loud in the Greek language, that is different than if you had it written in Aramaic, which isn't acceptable. Now we have
Are there possibly too many people in Alexandria, for example, who are doing just that and can't be ignored here?
Right. I don't know, but I don't really know what the actual case, the situation is. I just found it really fascinating that it was Rav and Shmuel who do not speak Greek. Right? They live under I guess it's a Persian government, right. Babylonian Persian government, and they don't speak Greek. So is it because from historically, like this has a special cachet with it because it's Greek, and that was in ancient times, from the Hellenistic period, a special language that the Jews use. It's almost like today where we would consider Aramaic, right? We have prayers in the service, the Kaddish, other passages from the Zohar that we read in Aramaic. And you'd say, well, why is that okay? Why do you read that in Aramaic? And again, these are traditional services where you're not reading English. Why is it okay to have Aramaic in the service? Well, Aramaic. I mean, that's the language of the Talmud. And, so I just wonder if Greek has this special status, even especially maybe exclusively for those who don't speak it as a language.
That's what Steinsaltz is saying, isn't it, at the bottom of the previous page where
Was that the note?
Steinsaltz interpolates.
Oh yeah, has a unique status.
Which has a unique status.
Right. So I think that seems to be what he's assuming. Because then we go on and we get to here we have a little interlude. Rabbi Acha, in the name of Rabbi Elazar again, says, where do we learn that God actually called Jacob God? Well, here we have this verse, Vayikra lo El Elohei Yisrael. Now it's usually translated as, and he, Jacob, called to him El, the God of Israel. But they read the punctuation a little differently. Vayikra lo, God called to him, Jacob, God called Jacob El, Elohei Yisrael. It was who was it who called Jacob God? Well, it was the Elohei Yisrael. So that's just a little, I'm not sure what the point of that was, like why, except maybe to just teach the exalted status of Yaakov among the patriarchs. Anyway, we're back to this language issue. Meitve kra'a giftit ivrit elamit madit yivanit. You got all these different languages, including Greek in this Baraita, Coptic, which I guess was giftit, or is it here? From the Greek, meaning Egyptian. Okay, here we go here. Ivrit, which is not the language that we call Hebrew, it's this ancient Hebrew. And then you have these other languages, but Greek is in there. It says if you read it in one of these languages, these foreign languages that obviously people were speaking in that time, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So here's the contradiction. And the answer is the clause in the Mishnah that teaches that the Megillah may be read in a foreign language to one who speaks that foreign language is comparable only to that which was taught in another Baraita. If one reads the Megillah in Coptic to Copts, or Ivrit to Ivrim, or Elamite to Elamites, or Greek to Greeks, he has filled his obligation. That is, you can, according to this Baraita, the Megillah can be read in any language to a person who speaks that language. So again, there seems to be a tension here between, is the Megillah a ritual experience, or is it epistemological, that is, understanding? Is it, you're supposed to understand the text? This seems to suggest that, yeah, you're supposed to understand it. So if you speak Coptic and you're speaking it to people who speak Coptic language, that's good. Then it's okay. You fulfilled your obligation because now you understand what the story is telling you. So, okay, but they go back to this statement from Rav and Shmuel. Why did Rav and Shmuel establish the ruling of the Mishnah as referring to specifically Greek? Let them interpret it as referring to any foreign language that one speaks. Why is Greek special? And they explain, rather the Mishnah is to be understood like the Baraita, that one who reads the Megillah in a language that he speaks fulfills the obligation. And that which was stated in the name of Rav and Shmuel was a general statement, even beyond whether you understand it or not. The Greek language is acceptable for everyone. Anyone who reads the Megillah in Greek has fulfilled his obligation, even if he does not understand Greek. Now let's see, their note says, the explanation of various opinions here, as well as the final halachic decision, is subject of debate among commentaries, as you can imagine. The Rif's opinion, Rabbi Alfasi, who was one of the earliest commentators on the Talmud, and was focusing on the halacha of the Talmud, here is unclear and is explained by several commentaries in various ways. Rabbi Zerachia Halevi, the Rambam, that's Maimonides, and other authorities maintain that although generally one may fulfill his obligation by hearing the Megillah in a foreign language if he understands that language, one can fulfill his obligation by hearing the Megillah in Greek, even if you don't understand Greek, as is the case with Hebrew. Other commentaries rule that even according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, only one who speaks Greek can fulfill his obligation by hearing the Megillah in Greek. If you remember, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was the one who started this off by saying Greek is unique. It's a unique language, which maybe made sense for Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel because that was the lingua franca of the world that Shimon ben Gamliel lived in. Okay, so they disagree with the opinion. So it's clearly very confusing to later commentators why Greek is so special, and why in some cases other languages are okay. Why we have Baraitas that say other languages are okay. But I have a feeling that it comes down to, as you were saying, that is this a ritual experience or is it to be understood? You want to be able to understand it because this is a great story. This is a what do you call Pirsumei Hanes, publicizing a miracle, and so we want to be able to understand it. So we still got more to go with the language stuff. The Gemara raises a difficulty, but the Baraita said, if one reads the Megillah in Greek to Greeks, you fulfill the obligation. This implies that reading in Greek, yes, it's acceptable if you speak Greek. But for everyone else, no, it is not. The Gemara answers, Rav and Shmuel disagree with this statement of the Baraita because they are following Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So now it becomes an issue of different Tanaitic statements. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel taught earlier, we saw that, even for books of the Bible, the sages did not permit them to be written in any foreign language other than Greek. So Greek has this special status, according at least to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rav and Shmuel are following that position. So then the response is, wait a minute, but if that was their intention, they should state so explicitly that the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Why did Rav and Shmuel formulate their statement as if they were issuing a new ruling? The Gemara answers, had they simply stated that the halacha is in accordance with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, I would have said that this applies only to the other books of the Bible, but with regard to the Megillah, of which it is written according to their writing, remember that was the focus of that verse, I would say that one does not fulfill his obligation if he reads it in Greek. If you read it, it's got to be written in Greek. Therefore, they stated their own opinion to teach us that even in the case of the Megillah, one fulfills his obligation if he reads it in Greek, right? So they were responding to that concern that we had before. Wait a minute, if it's written in Aramaic and you read it in Aramaic, it's still not okay.
Who is I here?
Who's the
I here?
Oh, that's a good. Let's see.
Just as the Gemara answers.
Yeah, I think it's the argument here that they're suggesting if a person, right, the Gemara is like personifying itself. Had they simply said the halakha is in accordance, then the person who's reading their statement, I would have assumed this.
Better
but don't do that assuming.
In modern English to say one.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. And again, I don't know, that's a good question, that if, and people who are obviously more learned in Talmud and Talmudic argumentation, if this means that perhaps it did come from a single source, like it came from a person who was saying I, but we just lost that, or whether it's just, as you say, a generic. One could say, that I don't know whether to argue one way or the other. All right, so here we go back. We're still with language, because the Mishnah taught the haloes, a person who speaks a foreign language, who heard in Hebrew, here's that ritual aspect, who heard it in Hebrew, Ashurit, he has fulfilled his obligation. So even if you didn't understand it, but you heard it in Hebrew, which is what we usually, I mean, here at Sinai, we have the translation up on the, now I've got the translation up on the screen. But even if you were just following along in the Hebrew and you didn't really know what was being said, it's okay. You fulfilled your obligation. I just want to see what one who speaks a foreign language. Some explain that as most Jews know some Hebrew, even one who knows no Hebrew can ask other people in the synagogue to explain to him at least the main idea of the Megillah. That's not the case with other languages. Okay, because Hebrew is different. Again, so the Behal lo yada mai ka amri, but the person won't understand what's being said. Then their explanation is midi dahava anashim ve'ami haaretz. It's just as it is with women and uneducated people. You see, put them in the same class. They too understand little Hebrew, but nevertheless, they fulfill their obligation when they hear the Megillah read in that language. Obviously, referring to the fact that, women at that time may not have known, right? They weren't going to schools at that time to learn Hebrew and to learn how to read the scripture. So in Hebrew. And Amei Haaretz, uneducated people who don't know how to read. Nevertheless, they should hear it in the Hebrew. So this is a ritual experience. Ravina, though, has a problem with this. Someone who doesn't understand the original, the untranslated language of the Megillah, how can that person fulfill his obligation? And not only that, but we know that there's, is this the passage? Let's see. We the sages who know Hebrew. There's words in the Megillah that come from Persian. Ha'achashtaranim, b'nei ramachim. These are not Hebrew words. So we don't understand that stuff. And how is it okay for us to just hear the Hebrew as written? Nevertheless, it's okay, because we're fulfilling the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, and it's pirsumei hanes, it's publicizing the miracle by reading the words as they appear in the original text. Here too, even if you speak a foreign language, but you don't know any of the Hebrew, let alone the Persian terms. Did he say that these were No, we'll get to that in a second. Some of these terms may even be in Greek. But anyway, we'll get to that in a second. You're doing a ritual act. So it's just like Hanukkah. You put the Megillah in the window, because the idea is to publicize the miracle. And in this case, the miracle should be read as it was written down originally in the Hebrew text, or the original text of the letter that Mordechai and Esther sent out. So whether you understand every word or you understand some of it, it's all okay, because it is the act of hearing the actual language of the text. And we actually, the custom is, when you read it, we pull out the entire text of the Megillah and we fold it up as if we are reading a letter. Is it in this week's text? I forget what pages, but you're not supposed to read it like the Torah with, on Atzei Chaim. You read it, it only has one pole, one wood connector, because you pull the whole thing out and then you fold it up, because you're supposed to look like you're reading a letter that we just got from Mordechai and Esther from Persia. So again, we even ritualize the act of the reading when we read it on Purim. Okay, so here's a really interesting section. The Mishnah continues, Kra'ah serugim yatsa. If one reads the Megillah at intervals, you fulfilled the obligation. So you don't have to read it all at once. You could break up the reading. But what's the word serugin? What does that mean? Oh, well, they had to learn it from Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's maidservant, who used it in context, and they figured out what the word meant. It means intervals. Similarly, the sages didn't know what was meant by the word halogalogot, which happens in various Mishnayot and Braitot. How'd they figure it out? Well, they heard the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi say to a certain person who was scattering purslane, how long will you go on scattering your halogalogot? Well, they learned from context that it's purslane. And another example, in Proverbs, there's a term salsaleha. How'd they learn what salsaleha means? Well, once again, the maidservant was talking to somebody and he was twirling his hair, and she said, how long are you going to go on twirling, misalsale your hair? From context, we learned that's the meaning. One more example, this one is from an Arab. They didn't know what Yahav is from the Book of Psalms. Again, Rabbi Baruch Hana, he learns it from he was traveling with an Arab, and the Arab used the term Yahav in context, and he understood what it meant. One more example from the maidservant. What's tate? Well, they heard her using it in context. It's a broom. I just saw this fascinating, because what they're suggesting is, the sages don't know everything. They learned it from a maidservant in the house of Rabbi Yehuda Nassi had to teach them. Or either that, or the idea is that the maidservant in the Rabbi Yehuda Nassi's house was smarter than the sages. We get back to the issue of serugin. What does that mean? What does it mean you can read it in intervals, but you can't read it out of order? Rabbi Mon, I don't know, is Rabbi Muna here? I don't know, I guess there's different ways of reading it. Rabbi Mona, Rabbi Muna.
Here, I saw your comment in your notes, and the pointing here is Mona in the Hebrew.
Here he points at Mona. In other texts, it's Muna. So I don't know. I guess there are different ways of pronouncing the name. Now he says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, if he pauses, and when he reads it at intervals, if he pauses and interrupts his reading long enough for one to finish the entire Megillah, which would be about 45 minutes, so it's a pretty long pause, then you got to go back. So you can't, it's not like you could pause it and then go have lunch, come back a few hours later. It means a short pause, but you don't have to read it all at once. You can take time out. The halacha is according to Rabbi Mona or Muna. Now, what does that mean? Long enough to read the whole Megillah, from the point where he paused until the end, or from the beginning to the end? And the understanding is it's got to be from the beginning to the end, because otherwise it's a very subjective amount of time. So when he says by intervals, no more than from the beginning to the end, he means from the very chapter 1. Okay. Rav said, okay, we have Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. Halacha ka Rabbi Muna. Shmuel says, Ein halacha ka Rabbi Muna. Besura matnu hachi. That's how they taught it in Surah. But in Pumbedita, they taught this teaching a little bit differently. The halacha is the same, it's just how they got there. In Pumbedita, they taught it slightly differently. They said, Rav Kahana said that Rav said the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Mona, but Shmuel said the halacha is not in accordance with Rabbi Mona. Rav Beve taught the opposite. Rav said the halacha is not in accordance with Rabbi Mona, but Shmuel said it's in the opinion of Rabbi Mona. So, okay, so how did they, why the difference? It seems kind of trivial here, just in terms of, it's just about accuracy in transmission. But the reason why is because, according to Rav Beve, Shmuel usually followed the individual dissenting opinion when it was more stringent than the majority opinion. And we have an example here from the laws of a deceased brother. When a man dies, he's married, his wife has not had any children, the surviving brothers, usually it's the next oldest brother, is supposed to either marry the sister-in-law to give her, so that they can have a child, and that child is accorded to the first brother who died, or, and today it's only the chalitza ceremony. Even by the Talmudic period, it was really only the chalitza ceremony, which is just a ceremony in which you say, I'm not fulfilling this obligation, and I release the woman, and I'm released from the obligation. So in a case where a woman was waiting for her brother-in-law, and while she's waiting for one of the brothers to fulfill that obligation, or the chalitza ceremony, one of the other brothers gets betrothed to the woman's sister. Now you can't do that. In general, you can't marry, you can't marry your sister's, your wife's sister. That's not a problem here if you hold that the oldest brother is the one obligated to the chalitza or the Levirate relationship. The younger brothers, you got 6 brothers, brother number 6 doesn't have a problem marrying the sister of the older brother's wife, because he's not going to be obligated. But according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, any one of the brothers could either do the Levirate marriage or the chalitza ceremony. Therefore, and this is a minority opinion, therefore what he would instruct the younger brother is wait until the oldest brother fulfills the mitzvah of Levirate or chalitza, and then you can go along with your marriage. That's a minority opinion, and Shmuel held by the minority opinion. So therefore, which was more stringent, right? Because none of the brothers can get married until at least until one of them, or the oldest brother, fulfills that obligation. So therefore, that's why Rav Beve taught that in this case, with the I forgot what the halacha was in the over here, that the halacha was, when you pause in the reading of the Megillah, the opinion that says if you wait too long, you have to go all the way back to the beginning and start over again. That seems to be the more stringent opinion. It's Rabbi Mona's opinion that's the minority opinion, or it's a singular opinion. So therefore, Rav Beve said that must be what Shmuel held, because he holds by the minority view if it's more stringent. Okay, that was a long way to get to his reasoning. All right. Oh boy, it's already past 12. All right. So Tana Rabbanan, Hishmit ba sofer otioto psukin, ukra'ana korei kim mitargumana mitargem yatsa. If the scribe who wrote the Megillah, now again, we're thinking we're reading in a Megillah written in Hebrew, so it's kosher scroll, and the person is reading it, right? Because we've learned that Hebrew, you can, even if you don't understand it, as long as you're hearing the Hebrew, but now there's a translator who's then translating it into the language. He has fulfilled the obligation. Oh, because there's missing parts. But the person's reading it, and we have to assume, even though they call them Miturgaman, let's see, I'm assuming here that what we're saying is he's reading it in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And maybe translating it after he's reading it in Hebrew. But
I don't think he was translating it at all necessarily.
Yeah, because he uses the term miturgaman. I mean, the term is miturgaman, and the translating it. So,
like from one language into another.
right. So I'm
for clarity, I mean, some things are implicit in languages and in the one language, but not in the other.
Yeah.
Clarity, you might add that.
Yeah.
In the translation. I think that's the sort of.
I think this is interpreting it as well. And, in Hebrew, you're doing the same thing that a translator does, is how I read that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the part that the questioning part is, we've already learned you can't recite it by heart. You've got to read the text from the text itself. But what if you get to a part of the text that's been blurred in, which is probably very common in the ancient world, in these scrolls, which are also probably very old, or just, that's the only text you've got. So the text is a little bit blurred, and then you read it from heart because you know the text by heart. So you just, even though you can't actually see the words or the verse, you translate it by heart, or you read it by heart. They're saying that's okay. So the objection is, if a Megillah contains letters that are blurred or torn, this is a Baraita, the following distinction applies. If their imprint is still visible, then the Megillah is fit for reading. But if not, it's unfit. If it's unfit for reading, then you shouldn't be able to just by heart fill in the blanks. So they say, okay, this isn't a contradiction. The second Baraita, which says that if a Megillah with blurred or torn letters is unfit, is referring to a case where this is the entire Megillah. It's all blurry. It's all hard to read. And you're trying to read, and you're doing it well. I know these parts, I know these words because I know the whole thing by heart. There's a few parts here where it's okay. That's what they're talking about. It's where basically the entire Megillah can't be read, and is therefore only being recited by heart. And then we have another Baraita which teach Hishmit ba'hakorei pasuk echad lo yomar ekra et kula ve'achar kach ekra oto pasuk. One verse is out, and you say, you know what? Let me just read the whole thing, and then I'll go back and I'll read that verse that I omitted, maybe from another scroll. Or rather, you've got to go back and read that from that verse that he omitted and continued from there to the end of the Megillah. You can't, because that's reading it out of order. Similarly, if one enters a synagogue and encounters a congregation that's already read half of the Megillah, he may not say, I will read the second half of the Megillah with the congregation, and then I'll go back and read the first part. You got to go back, you've got to read the whole thing. This is, it's very interesting. The halacha is that if let's say I'm reading the Megillah from the scroll, and you're reading it, or you're trying to follow along, you've got to follow along every word that I'm reading, as if you're reading it from the scroll. So that's right, if you're reading it from the printout, the paper text, you've got to follow along. But if you bring your own Megillah, and in fact, it was very nice. Al Fram years ago gave me his family had a Megillah, and he gave it to me, so that obviously his family had their own. It's a little one. It's a teeny little Megillah that they would bring. One of his ancestors would bring to the synagogue and follow along, so that if he wasn't paying attention for a verse, he could just go back and read the verse himself. But the idea is you have to read the entire text from beginning to end. Dozing off is the next passage. If you're dozing off, that's okay. But if you're completely asleep, not okay. And what does it mean, dozing? So what's that? Well, you're kind of awake, you're not awake. If someone calls him, he answers. So, but he's not exactly sure what was being said. But when people remind him about what happened, he could remember it. And Rabbi Joshua Kulp, who in his commentary on this gives a great example, and it's so funny because it's exactly like my father. He said when he was growing up, they'd be watching television, his father would be watching something on the TV, and his eyes would be closed, and he'd be, oh, Dad's asleep, I'll just change the channel. And immediately his father would wake up and say, wait, why'd you change the channel? And it was because I did the exact same thing. He would be like dozing off, he'd be snoring, and I changed the channel from the news to whatever television show I wanted. And he would immediately say, why, what did you just do? Why did you change the channel? I was like, I thought you were sleeping. So that, even though it seems like the person's sleeping, that's what he calls dozing off. That the person's kind of there, maybe if they're not 100%, but it's enough for you to, you would still fulfill your obligation by hearing the majority of it and knowing what's going on. But does the one really fill his obligation that way? Didn't Rabbi Chelbo say that Rabbi Chama Bar Guria said that Rav said the halacha is in accordance with the statement of the one who says that the Megillah must be read in its entirety to fulfill one's obligation. And moreover, he said that according to the one who said that one need not read the entire Megillah, but only from chapter 2, we'll get to that later, only from chapter 2 and onward, the Megillah itself must never, and onward, that you could actually start with a public reading from Esther 2.5. Nevertheless, even that person agrees the entire Megillah has to be written out. You can't start the Megillah text from chapter 2. But even so, you've got to read it in its entirety. It should be read in, I mean, even if you don't have to read it in its entirety, you've got to, the text itself has to be written completely. So, okay, wait, that's a special case in which a complete Megillah from beginning to end is lying before him, and he's copying it, and he was reading from the complete Megillah verse by verse, and then he was writing each verse in the new copy. The Gemara proposes, let us say that this supports the opinion of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, who said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, it is prohibited to write even a single letter of the Bible when not copying from a written text. You can't write the biblical text from memory. Well, maybe that's not a proof, as perhaps the Mishnah is merely dealing with a case where this is what happened to be what occurred, that one happened to be copying the text from an existing Megillah, but there's not a requirement to do this. Okay, so now we get into detail about the text here. How many do we got? I think, okay, almost done here. With regard to the matter itself, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said, Rabbi Yochanan said, it's prohibited to write even a single letter of the Bible when not copying from a written text. Objection. One Adar, there was an incident involving Rabbi Meir, he was going to help the people in Asia Minor, that's Turkey, fix up their calendar. And he couldn't do it in Eretz Israel. And there was no Megillah there when Purim arrived. So he wrote the Megillah by heart, and then he read from it. Rabbi Abahu said, Rabbi Meir is different. As in him, you can fulfill the verse, Ve'afapecha yashiru negdecha. Your eyelids look straight before you. You don't lose focus. Rabbi Chama said to Rabbi Yirmiyah of Difti, what does that mean? Look straight before you. He said, this is referring to the words of Torah, which are difficult to remember exactly, and with regard to which it is written, will you glance upon it fleetingly from the root, Aleph Pei Pei, with your eyes? It is already gone. So but nevertheless, they remain exact, miyusharin, in the memory of Rebbe Meir, since he knows them all by heart. So the idea is that Rebbe Meir was unique. You're not supposed to write it by heart because people can't remember it, can't remember every word. It's hard to memorize all of the text. It's like, it's something that's in front of your eyes. It's fleeting. It goes away, except for Rebbe Meir, who never had that problem. Okay, so now we get another case. It is related to Rav Chisda. Once found Rav Hananel writing Torah scrolls, but he was not copying them from a written text, as he knew them all by heart. He said, it is fitting for the entire Torah to be written by your mouth, that is relying on your memory, but the sages said it's prohibited. The Gemara asked, since Rav Chisda said to him, the entire Torah is fitting to be written by your mouth, it could be concluded by inference that the words of the Torah were exact in his memory, because Rav Hananel enjoyed mastery, but nevertheless, it wasn't permitted. On the other hand, we said that Rebbe Meir wrote a Megillah without copying from a text due to a similar proficiency. How come Rebbe Meir could get away with it? The answer is different circumstance. It was Purim. They had to read the text. There was no text for Rebbe Meir to write out, so it's called Sha'at Hadachak, a time of exigent circumstances. Sha'at Hadachak, it's like an emergency situation. It's different, and so therefore you had no other options. Okay, in that case, Rebbe Meir could write out the entire Megillah by heart and then recite it from the text, and that's okay. But otherwise, you would not. Even a person who knows the text by heart, you don't copy. You don't write without copying from a text. Last piece here is there are things that are permitted to be written by heart. Tefillin and mezuzot. In accordance with whose opinion did Abai permit that? In accordance with the opinion of the following Tana, Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of our master, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Tefillin and mezuzot may be written when they are not copied from a written text and they do not require scoring. That is, having lines etched into the text and then writing it in that way. You write down from the scored line as opposed to we write to the bottom. They would start at the top of the line. So that was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's opinion. However, the halacha is different. Phylacteries, the tefillin, don't require scoring, but a mezuzah does. Unlike biblical books, these tzrichin sirtut. Did I read? No, sorry. Nichtavot shalom nichtav. You can write it without a text, because these texts, what's written, the passage in the mezuzah and the passage in tefillin are so well known, and they're known by heart. There's 4 passages in tefillin. There's the one passage of the Shema, and the second paragraph of the Shema in the mezuzah. Certainly those 2 paragraphs you know by heart because you recite them twice a day. The tefillin have another 2 paragraphs from chapter 13 in the book of Exodus, which also refer to tefillin. Again, not so hard to memorize. So those you can write from memory, but the difference is that the mezuzah parsha, that's not the word I want. The scroll itself has to be scored. And that's a really good thing to know, because a lot of times when you buy mezuzot, even from Israel, and they say they're kosher, you can tell right away they're not kosher, because the parchment is not scored. It's just written out. And besides the fact that text usually looks ridiculous, and the letters are very poorly written. But so you really have to be careful in getting kosher mezuzot these days, because there's so much invalid ones that are going around. But anyway, that's the end of that passage. So we'll pick up next week with 19. Okay, we went a little long today, but a lot of stuff. Okay, let's okay. So we'll send out the material for next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.